All right, so to provide more context or more details on the computation for factory overhead variances, we have another sample problem here wherein I believe we are only focusing on total fixed factory overhead variances. All right. So the given company A standard cost system contains the following overhead costs computed based on a monthly normal volume of 25,000 or 50,000 direct labor hours, right? So the volume is 25,000 units, okay? Variable factory overhead 12 per unit, whereas fixed factory overhead is 8 per unit, okay? So actual cost data are as follows. Actual factory overhead costs incurred, variable overhead 316,860, fixed overhead 225,000 pesos. Actual production is at 26,000 units, whereas actual direct labor hours is at 54,600 hours. Right? So the required analysis is total fixed overhead variance, fixed overhead spending or budget variance, and volume variance. Okay? So more on the side of fixed factory overhead. So we could go ahead and follow a similar analysis here wherein we plot both actual fixed overhead and standard fixed overhead to the right? So actual fixed overhead to the left and standard to the right. Total actual fixed overhead is just given. It's 225,000 pesos. And for standard fixed overhead, we have to multiply the standard rate of 8 pesos multiplied by 26,000. Alright, so if you go back to the problem, okay, we have actual, okay, fixed factory overhead 225,000. Okay, and then we have actual production 26,000 units. We multiply that by 8 pesos per unit. Okay, this time we actually go directly into the per unit amount here, okay, without making use of the 50,000 because this is denominated in a per unit amount. Right, so 26 times 8 provides us with the standard of 208,000 pesos here, right? And then of course, following a similar analysis, we could insert budgeted fixed overhead in the middle, having 8 pesos, okay, as the standard rate multiplied by 25,000 as the normal capacity, okay, which gives us 200,000 pesos as the budgeted fixed overhead. So where did we get 25,000? It is just a given amount here, 25,000 normal volume. Okay, so that's that. And then afterwards, we can just proceed to compute for the variances between, these amounts. All right, so just a quick note here. Again, budgeted fixed overhead is based on normal capacity. Normal capacity times standard rate provides that amount. Standard fixed overhead is based on standard hours per unit times the actual production multiplied by the standard rate. All right. So if we deduct the first with the second amount, which is the budgeted amount, we get fixed spending variance of 25,000 unfavorable. And then if we deduct the budgeted against the standard fixed overhead, we get the volume variance of 8,000 favorable. All right, so this is a similar case wherein we have two, offsetting variances, which leads to a netted, total variance of 17,000 unfavorable pesos. All right. All right, so after being able to discuss total fixed factory overhead as well as after being able to discuss total direct material, direct labor, variable factory, fixed factory overhead, as well as total factory overhead, we now can proceed to discuss the materials mix, price, and yield variances. Okay. So similar with the previous ones, we could still follow a similar analysis wherein we can plot it through a visual diagram. Okay. So just a quick note with regard to material, price, mix, and yield. We could use these type of analysis if we have more than one direct material type which is inputted into production, right? Which is normally the case in practice. Okay. So more or less, materials mix and yield analysis would be applicable in practice. All right. So we could go ahead and plot the actual material cost to the left here, actual price times actual quantity. And then we have standard cost to the rightmost portion, which is standard average standard output cost, or ASOC, okay, multiplied by total actual output. Okay, later on we will be learning how to compute average standard output cost. Okay, but basically, in essence, this is the total standard cost for materials. Again, right here, we could already compute for the total material variance by deducting these two amounts together, right? And then to provide further analysis, we could compute for the actual quantities at standard prices for direct material. And then we could also plot average standard input cost, or ASIC, multiplied by total actual input. Okay, later on, we'll also be defining what ASIC, how ASIC is computed, right? And then going down, the price variance here, we could compute for this if we deduct actual materials cost versus standard price at actual quantity input. Okay. Note that for the price variance computed using this analysis, we should compute for this using each type of material. Okay, so later on in our sample problem, we have quite a number of different materials wherein we would individually be computing for the price variances for each one, right? And then if we deduct the actual quantity at standard prices against the total actual input multiplied by the average standard input cost, we would arrive at the material mix variance. And then if we also deduct the average standard input cost multiplied by total actual input against the average standard output cost multiplied by the total actual output, we get the yield variance, right? So in this sense, we are actually already comparing standard input cost, standard output cost, as well as actual input and actual output. Okay, so that leads to the yield variance. Right, and then if we go ahead and sum or get the total of all of these variances, we get the total material variance here. All right. So just a quick note on how to compute for the average standard input and average standard output costs. For the ASIC, we arrive at this by getting the total standard input cost, okay, over the total standard input quantity, okay. Whereas for the ASOC, or the output cost, we get the total standard input cost over the total standard output quantity, okay. Alright, so now we proceed to a sample material price mix and yield problem. So here are the given. Company A combines three types of materials to produce its product, okay. For a 100 kilo batch, the standard cost for materials are as follows. Okay, so we have here given, we have the standard quantity, the standard price, as well as the total standard quantities and standard prices for each type of material. Okay, as we discussed earlier, this type of analysis is applicable to the production line having different kinds of materials. During August, the company produced 200 batches, or 20,000 kilos of its product. Okay, so 200 times 100 kilo per batch gives us 20,000 kilos, right? Materials used in production, so these are actually the actual costs already. We have the different materials here. We have the actual quantity used, and then we have the actual prices at these quantities, which gives us the total actual amounts, okay? Now, the required for this one is to analyze it between its variances, so price, mix, and yield, right? So if we follow a similar approach, we first compute for the average standard input cost. So again, as mentioned, we get the total standard input cost, 516 pesos, over the total standard input quantity of 120 kilograms, right? Gives us 4.3 pesos per kilogram. Now, how did we get 516 over 120? We go to the previous slide. Total standard input cost, okay, for each batch is 516 pesos here, right? And then we divide that by the standard quantity for each batch of 120 kilograms, which provides us the average standard input cost, okay? Now, if we proceed to compute for the average standard output cost, similarly, we get the total standard input cost here. Then we divide that by the total standard output quantity this time. Okay? So same, 516. But this time, we divide it by 100 kilograms, which gives us 5.16 pesos per kilogram. So the 100 kilograms is the total standard output quantity, which is basically how much is the quantity per batch. Okay, so we have here 100 kilo batch is the output. Okay, so if I just like to point out as well, look at if we try to look at this, standard quantity input 120 kilogram. Okay, which provides 100 kilo output. Okay, so basically 120 kilograms yields us 100 kilos of product. Okay, after it has undergone the production line. Right, so that's something to point out here. And then lastly, we get the total cost, okay, for actual quantities at standard prices. Basically, we would be trying to arrive at this amount. Okay, because earlier we mentioned that to arrive at the price variance, we should compute these for each type of material. Okay, so that starts by computing standard prices at multiplied by actual quantities at this level. Okay, so if we compute for each type of material here, okay, we could arrive at the price variance computed for each type of material in the level right below. Okay, so let's proceed. Total cost for actual quantities at standard prices. Okay, so basically we get the actual quantity, multiply that by the standard price for each type of product, then we get the total here, and then of course summing everything, we get the total below. Okay, so now let me just point out how did we get these figures. So actual quantity, basically this is it, actual quantity of input multiplied by the standard prices above. Okay, so 12,600 times 5, 73 times 4, and then 47 times 3. All right. Okay, so that's basically our analysis here. Then we with that we get a total of 116,300 pesos. Okay. Now we can proceed to plot everything in our visual diagram. We have actual material cost here, 106,390. We have standard price at actual quantity here, 106,300. So we plot that as well. And then we can immediately get the total price variance of 90 pesos unfavorable. Unfavorable because we spent more than what we expected at standard prices. Okay. And then now we proceed to analyze further by multiplying ASIC times total actual input this time. So 4.3 from our slide earlier multiplied by input of 24,600. So where did we get 24,600? Basically this one. Okay, the quantity input, actual quantity of inputs. Okay, next we compute for the material mix variance, which is the difference between this amount and this amount, which leads to 520 unfavorable variance. Okay, and then lastly we compute for the total standard cost, just basically the ASOC multiplied by the total actual output this time. So 516 from the one earlier, 5.16 per kilo. Okay, multiply that by the total actual output of 20,000 kilos. Okay, so we arrive, okay, 516 times 20,000, we arrive at 103,200 pesos. So if we deduct this amount and this amount, we get the yield variance of 2,580 unfavorable. Okay, variance. And then same analysis, if we get the total of everything, we get the total variance of 3,190 unfavorable. Okay, because they all add up to being a greater unfavorable variance overall. Okay, so again, I'd like to point out as well, if we get the standard cost, we deduct the actual materials cost from that, we arrive at basically the same amount of variance, 3,190 unfavorable down below. Okay?